Hello, everyone, and welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. The Security Weekly crew is taking some time off for the holiday, but we put together a special treat for you. Instead of pulling an episode out of our vault, we pre-recorded one for you. This week, Derek Manky and I discussed the latest FortiGuard Labs threat report. Some very interesting stuff in there that you should check out. Then we've got some pre-recorded executive interviews for you that we recorded at the RSA conference earlier this month. For our first trio of interviews, I interview Alexandre Sierra, CTO and founder of Tenchi Security, about the company's exciting new approach to third-party cyber risk management. Then Jeff Mann interviews Margarita Barrero, head of international business at Axure, about handling external threats like brand impersonation and phishing scams. And finally, I interview Andy Grolnick, the CEO of Graylog, also one of our show's current sponsors, about strategy and execution when it comes to threat detection and incident response. For the second group of 3 executive interviews, which, by the way, are about 15 minutes apiece, very short and sweet, Akira Brand interviews Mike Leiborg, CISO and at Swimlane, about the value of cybersecurity marketplaces from a CISO perspective. Then I interview Jim Broom, president and CTO at Direct Defense, about security concerns from the surge in generative AI adoption. And this is just one of 2 interviews that we did with Jim Broom at the conference. And finally, Ben Carr interviews Chris Lahiri, co-founder and CISO of Ignite, about the current ransomware threat landscape. All that and more in this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Today, I'm talking with Derek Manky, Fortinet's Chief Security Strategist and the Global VP of Threat Intel at FortiGuard Labs. And FortiGuard Labs puts out their Global Threat Landscape Report twice a year. And the latest one just came out a few weeks ago. And I also just got back, or we all just got back from RSA, and I have a lot of insights to share and questions about the current state of attacks. Welcome to the show, Derek. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Adrian. It's always great to speak with you. Thanks.
Yeah, likewise. And I love digging through these reports, looking at all the insights here. And I think this one, particularly liking this report this year. But before I dig into some of the highlights and what I like about it, maybe give us some background on the report, how long you've been doing it, how often it comes out, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So the report, it's a biannual data crunch that we do now at the first and second half of the year. So the recent one is from the second half of 2023. We've been doing this for a long time, as far back as, I've been 20 years at Fortinet. It goes back as far as 2010, if not earlier, in some simple forms. But the whole idea is that we leverage our FortiGuard Labs intelligence. It's our native intelligence that we pull in our labs. We get hundreds of billions of events coming in a day nowadays that we need to correlate, normalize, separate the signal from the noise, do the threat hunts, do the research. We do that daily. This report is a 6-month crunch of that, basically looking at the key findings. So,
yeah, and I was very pleased to see the MITRE ATT&CK heat map in this one. That's something we had talked about in the past, and I love. So it's interesting because Scientia came out with a report not too long ago. I'm not sure if you saw that one, where they did a meta-analysis of different techniques used by attackers and then mapped that to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and basically found something similar that I can see in the heat map here. Actually a lot of the MITRE ATT&CK framework never gets used by attackers or isn't used very much by attackers. Does that mesh with what you guys are seeing as well?
It does mesh, and when it's used heavily, specifically with, as you can see, from, and we've actually featured that heat map for several reports now, but it's a great one, I agree, and it's things like defense evasion, which is a heavily used tactic. A lot of the techniques in there are frequently used, and what it tells us is that, we've talked about this before, but it reinforces it, that attackers like to follow the the path of least resistance. They have a game board, they have a playbook. If it works, right? Why reinvent the wheel? And so that concept rings true in a lot of even outside of the heat map. We can get into that in terms of targets that they're looking at, CVEs they're exploiting, and things like that too. And by the way, the heat map, I'm also excited about it because we implemented it. Right, this actually came out of MITRE Ingenuity, the Center for Threat Informed Defense. We are a research partner with them. This came out of the sightings ecosystem, where we can actually pull real live data to telemetry on TTPs rather than the IOCs.
Well, in general, that's something I love seeing here too. We'll talk about EPSS a bit, but I
Mhm.
love seeing all this collaboration between these different organizations. EPSS sits over at first. MITRE does a lot of stuff. It's great to see in these reports so much cooperation going on.
Yeah, and they're great examples of not just there's a lot of good ideas out there and will in the industry. There's a skills gap, so it's also a matter of how do we put resources and prioritize towards this. But yeah, the work with MITRE is a great example of that. You mentioned first.org, another excellent example too. Yeah.
And with the attack framework, I don't mean to imply that the framework isn't useful because maybe only 5% of it seems to ever get used. I liken it to like a dictionary, right? Like
Mhm.
just because I'm writing a novel doesn't mean I need to use every word in the dictionary. It's meant to be comprehensive, right?
Yeah.
So some of it's natural that some of it gets used more than others.
Yeah, and it's only going to expand. So, of course, MITRE ATT&CK framework. Now you also have FIGHT. So, attack for 5G. You have MITRE ATT&CK on ICS, critical infrastructure. They all describe,
Mhm.
it's the same idea. Uh, you know, my take on that is that it's a toolkit, right? There's 13 plus versions of the enterprise framework. You have more and more techniques. So the tactics don't change really, right? But the techniques are changing as they add a new tool or a new technique. It's added to the toolkit. Do they need to use it? Probably not, because for the past 6 months, the hammer, in analogy, is the weapon of choice, right? And so that's what we often see.
Well, and I think the point I want to get to here and the importance of the heat map is that defenders have to prioritize. If you're going through the MITRE ATT&CK framework like a checklist and trying to put defenses in place for everything on there, you're probably not doing it right. You probably want to focus your efforts where attackers are focusing theirs, and same thing when we get into vulnerabilities. Like there's some really
Yeah.
interesting side channel vulnerabilities out there. Attackers are never going to use them. They're just not practical for use. It's interesting that it's good to know that it's possible, I guess, some of this stuff. But like
Yeah.
how often did we see attackers using like beast and crime and SSL vulnerabilities and things like that?
Beast. Oh, that's going way back. I was in Argentina when
Yeah.
that broke at Echo Party. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. Echo Party. Yep.
Yeah. You're right. And it's the classic path again. It's attackers have, they're just like any business, right? They have time, they have resources. It's a cost imposed when you're trying to do something more sophisticated against something, instead of trying to go under, the low hanging fruit, go under the bar that's set lower, right? Why raise the bar if you don't have to? Other than the exceptional ones we do see, right, with APT, and we can talk about that. There's definitely two lenses here, but for the vast majority of attacks that we're seeing, it's the former, right? It's the path of least resistance, and again, doing things that are in their toolkits that are hot off the shelf and that they can use. Yeah,
And we call it a heat map, but I also find it interesting that there are cool points on the map also. So it doesn't just indicate what's being used, but it indicates what's being used more versus what's being used less.
yeah.
So you also have it goes from red to blue. So it doesn't just go 0 to 10. It goes like 10 to -10, maybe is the way to look at the values on
Yeah,
the
and,
map.
and it's a nice visual again to show what's cool, as you said. Cool is in cooled off, and what to deprioritize in a sense, right? It gives a nice visual for that. I mean, this is so the attack framework's been around for a long time, but the implementation of this with heat maps and also attack flow, which we're not there yet, but we're getting there. That's
Mm.
all threat informed defense, right? That's the whole concept of threat informed defense, right? Doing purple teaming. So combining red team, blue team results, looking at any given emulation of an attack, whether it's MITRE Caldera or some breach and attack simulation tool that you have, matching that up with your defenses, looking at what works, what doesn't, what you have to cover in terms of those hot TTPs. It's that detection engineering cycle that goes through, right? And yeah, it's a more practical approach to security rather than building a giant fortress against an invisible enemy, right?
Yeah. And I think that's those are the most valuable parts of this report to me. The parts that really zero in on what attackers are actually doing, where they're finding success. Because some of these reports I look at them and they're like, it's getting real bad out there. Like
Yeah,
these attacks are increasing. And without those kind of details, like that's I don't really need that kind of information. Like I know there's lots of attacks out there. I know that
yeah.
they're probably going to increase.
Well,
Tell me where to focus.
yeah, and we can talk about this, but the interesting thing, I agree, there's a lot of bloat out there when it comes to
Yeah.
numbers and talking about the problem. And today it's a million, tomorrow it's a trillion, right? And I think it's actually interesting. We talk about this in the report too. We're seeing a change to that actually. The if you look at ransomware as an example, we noted a
Mhm.
70% drop. It's going the other way in terms of volume. But again, I
Right.
explained this is not a good thing necessarily. Actually, it isn't a good thing because we're seeing their strategy shifts, right? They're becoming much more
Yeah.
selective in the targets, higher in the ransom demands. The risk is higher.
So let's go ahead and we can shift into that discussion. So the nature of ransomware, and we've talked a lot about this over the years, how it's kind of shifted from like it started out very opportunistic,
Mhm.
targeting individuals before they had the idea to focus on ransoming an entire business instead of just an individual. Get those bigger payouts.
Yeah.
Started out encrypting data, then stealing data and threatening to expose it. As the ransom lever, and we talked for a while about like when are the wipers coming? When are when are they going to just threaten to destroy equipment or wipe equipment so that it has to be physically replaced? Like we had seen Saudi Aramco and Shamoon, so we know it's possible and people are, at least at the state actor level, willing to use it. But a lot of state actor stuff tends to filter down.
Mhm.
And maybe talk a bit about this current shift. You say there's a decrease in volume, but why is that not a good thing? And where are things moving now?
Good news, bad news. I mean, there is a good news piece of that because they are focusing their time and effort onto bigger targets. Some of the, let's say, SMBs and other space are slightly less impacted. Again, this isn't holistic or complete. I'm just talking about some of the larger operators. So it's not always, a bad news scenario. But in reality, what we're seeing is that the impact in terms of cybercrime is increasing, right? So we're seeing 7 to 8 figure ransom demands. We're seeing the target of ransomware now shifting to operational technology, which is inclusive of critical infrastructure. It's the number one sector we talk about is manufacturing, right? And again, it's this expanded playbook and strategy. So going back to MITRE ATT&CK and the TTPs, the playbook is part of that, right? We're seeing now, and this has been evolving for some time, from basic encryption of data to shift moving away from that because that low hanging fruit started to become less and less effective with backup strategies and so forth, to the ever popular extortion now model of information, right? Threaten to release something public or go after a revenue stream because they know that translates to X amount of dollars lost in revenue a day. So they can demand Y ransom, right? That's the reality that we're at today. And so with that playbook, the target shift now, because those revenue streams that they're going after are the big ones. They're going again after manufacturing. They're going after, unfortunately, healthcare and hospitals because they know it causes a lot of disruption. Right? That's the game, and
And there's a
that
lot of
gets
low hanging fruit there, right?
yeah, there is yeah, and it gets into the it gets also into um the ethics that continue to go out the window. It's basically just more and more aggressive. Wipers are part of that component. We've seen affiliate based instruction, so ransom as a service, starting to toss what little ethics they did have, i.e., don't go after operating rooms with mission critical systems in healthcare and hospital. That's starting to go out of the window now in terms of like free for alls. Um, there's been even limited instances of physical violence now. So you have that cyber physical component coming in. It's just more and more aggressive, more of an aggressive nature happening from the criminals because they're again honing in onto specific targets, and so the risk is higher, right?
Yeah, I recall when Mark Andreessen put out his "Software is Eating the World" blog post back in 2009, 2010. He revisited that 10
Mm,
years later, and reflected that he was basically right. Software ate the world, except for healthcare. Apparently that was the one place that
right.
things did not modernize, digital transformation did not occur in a lot of cases. It's the one place we all go where many of us, at least here in the US, still have to write things down, our social security number down on a piece of paper, right? Which just seems ancient compared to how everything else is modernized. Like we pay with our phones. Everything else came into the future. It seems, except for healthcare. So I suspect, yeah, I mean, high priority on keeping operations running. So that makes it easier to ransom, but also the fact that they just didn't move forward. I think makes them a more attractive target because they're easy. They're an easy
Yeah,
target, right?
yeah. As you said, low hanging fruit, and we also have convergence, right? So you talk about convergence of operational technology and IT systems.
Yeah,
The end goal of that is a good thing, but in reality, that's a slow journey. And so you have operational technology, sensors and devices, including, healthcare and hospital, that are sometimes sitting on unsegmented flat networks, which is a massive issue, right? And that comes back to
yeah,
the low hanging fruit you talked about. Just to back this up in the report, the other figure we put out there was that ransomware, all of our global ransomware that we observed, 44% of that, so nearly half, was all related to operational technology. That's a big shift from before again.
key being like industrial systems. You talked about manufacturing, things like that.
Yeah, manufacturing, transportation, logistics. It's a wider set, of course, but it is the new hot target. Yeah.
So are they using the same malware? Or is there any indication that they have special knowledge, or that they're building anything specifically for OT environments, or are the environments similar enough that the same techniques, the same TTPs, and the same malware works in those environments?
Unfortunately, it's the latter. It's typically it's the
Mm,
same malware we're seeing. Why again? Because you have this convergence effect, right? Where you have traditional IT networks that directly impact OT. So we have seen cases. I mean, look, that were specific to critical infrastructure in the past. We did research on that, like ECANs or Snake. Um, but in reality, a lot of it is still Windows based. It's still the same
yeah,
ransom as a service operators, and unfortunately more affiliates now that are targeting these environments because a commission payout on a 7 or 8 figure ransom is worth their effort more, right?
yeah. And yeah, I think anybody hoping that eventually XP will be more secure because modern malware won't work on it anymore, I wouldn't hold my breath. Just go back and use old stuff.
Yeah. No, yeah, legacy is a big issue. That's also another piece of the report we talk about on the vulnerability space too. Yeah, we've been talking about it a long time, but it's a reality. Yeah.
Yeah, so before we pivot over to talking about vulnerabilities, because I want to talk about speed a little
Uh,
bit. Let's talk a little bit about the ransomware groups. This is something that I haven't really kept track of over the years, but when I looked at on page 27, um, you've got a list of the most active ransomware groups, and apparently I didn't miss much. Lockbit's still number one. Clop, AlphaV are the top three. But there's some new ones popping up. Like you talk about ransom VC a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And this is typical. It comes in a cycle. We see a lot of the usual culprits. And by the way, this was pre seizure and takedown with Lockbit. It's always interesting, right? Because we've seen this in the past with some of these other groups where you have a disruption effort that happens, which of course is great. Following that, there's a stumble. Sometimes there's a recovery. Sometimes, a lot of the times, there is some recovery, but it's not full recovery. I mean, we showed this. I think we've talked about it before back in the original CryptoWall V3, which was like the first biggest ransomware group out there. And after the disruption efforts we did, they just never came back. But the moral of the story is this is market share, right? Somebody else is going to step up and take that slice of the market. Essentially, they're gonna take the place, and that's what we outline in the report. You do have these. We used to call it rookie of the half, right? But these up and coming groups. But at the end of the day, yeah, new code, new affiliate program, new operators. Going back to that MITRE ATT&CK framework, going to their strategy, it's the same models, right? We're talking about ransom as a service. We're talking about the same TTPs that do work in these instances.
Yeah. Yeah, and shifting over to what some of these crews are using, I think one trend I saw somebody talking about was that we're seeing more vulnerability exploitation and less use of credential stuffing, stolen creds, and stuff like that. Though clearly, like nothing's going to zero. Like it's kind of just a shift that we're seeing there. But one of the things I'm really interested about is speed.
Mm-hmm.
Is So one of the themes I saw at RSA, a lot of people talking about, at least on the vendor side, not necessarily on the defender side, but vendors are talking about and introducing products that do automated remediation. I'm not sure defenders are quite ready for automatically disabling accounts, isolating machines, taking things out of production, without a human in the loop. But what I started wondering about, thinking about, like, how fast does the defender have to be? How quickly does something go from vulnerability disclosure to being actively exploited? I think you've got some numbers in the report on that as well.
Yeah, and Adrian, this is what I mean. There's obviously a lot of good data in the report. If you were to ask me what really stood out the most, this would be it: the speed.
Oh, really?
Not
Okay.
not that I didn't expect it, but it's the acceleration that's happening. That's what surprised me. How quickly that gap is closing. So what I mean by that is um, so the actual number in the report was 4.76. That's the number. So just under 5 days. What that measurement is when we looked at any new CVE in the second half of 2023 that was published, how long from publication to when we, from our intelligence, saw it exploited in the wild. 4.76, so just under 5 days. That number in the first half, so we have a baseline. That number in the first half was hovering around 8. So it was 3.5 days quicker, essentially, in the second half, in 6 months. That was much higher than I would have anticipated it to be. So again, it keeps on going in that direction. Even dating back to Log4j, that was obviously massive at the time. Everyone and their dog on the cyber criminal
Yeah,
side.
yeah,
We're trying to latch onto that. Um, and so that's like all hands on deck. Let's go as quick as we can. Even that at the time was around 8 days too, around 7 to 8 days. And that's again, full focus. We're already at almost half of that metric now. For not the log4js, like I'm talking about everything being added to the kit. So that's basically the answer to, and there's no silver bullet to that, but generally we're talking about days now instead of what we were talking about in the past years ago in weeks or months. Um, Going back to your other point you're talking about though, about is the industry ready? I think I know this word is overused a lot, but it's a journey, right? Um, just like with any tool, you're not going to get to the end game right away. There is a lot of, so there's a lot of great technologies through automation and intelligence and some applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's a trust aspect, right? Where you can not have a fully autonomous self-healing network that says just go and protect everything, right? We're not there. But you do have tools, a lot of it through SOAR, through SIM, through EDR, all these connected endpoints. We do it in our fabric at Fortinet, where you can at least reduce the mundane, like those cycles that an analyst, humans are slow, right? That a human would have to do, that doesn't have a high trust aspect to it, like cutting off adding a policy to a production network. But I'm talking about from a SOC perspective, right? There's a lot of things that can be done to allow you to respond, certainly within that 5-day window, definitely even within a 24-hour window.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things here, at least that occurs to me, is that your traditional vulnerability management process probably isn't going to be quick enough anymore. You probably need to learn about this from another source than wait for your vulnerability scanning vendor to build a check for it. For that to go through QA, for it to filter down to your scanner and your next scheduled scan run, and then you find out that there's WooCommerce vulnerability, or whatever vulnerability we're talking about here, that you've got exposed to the public internet is vulnerable to attack. The attack's probably already happened by the time that whole process completes and an analyst looks at the scan results. So I imagine you need more of like a threat intelligence approach to find
Yeah.
out about these vulnerabilities and react to them. The moment that they're disclosed, not when your scanner tells you got a problem.
Absolutely. Threat intelligence tools. I think it's an ecosystem, right? It's everything from layered defense, so being able to have IPS and virtual patches in place,
Yeah,
if it's not realistic or pragmatic
mitigations.
to apply a past education. From a threat intelligence aspect in the report, we have the red zone. That's a great one to talk about. That's exactly that. It's like a top list prioritizing. These are the ones, and we can get into the EPSS discussion. That's all part of that. And then and I know this is a whole nother conversation. We signed the Secure by Design pledge at RSA with CISA. That's that whole responsible disclosure discussion, transparency, getting that notice out as quickly as possible also, so people know, right? And they can prepare and react to that, because the attackers are moving this fast, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned a couple of things there. Red zone is something I think I missed. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about EPSS for prioritizing
Sure.
vulnerability response.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so the red zone, we've had at least 3 reports now, so we got a good baseline on it, and this is a good news piece, because that baseline has been very steady actually. So what the baseline is we look at the total attack surface, so all known CVEs, there's over 200,000 of them. We know that keeps on snowballing, right? It was like about 29,000 last year in 2023. I think around 25,000 the year before, net new, right? So that the attack surface keeps expanding. So we look at that total attack surface. You can't manage 200,000 CVEs, right? And then we look at the
right.
open attack surface. So on average, like throughout all organizations that we see, what ones are actually open, unpatched. And then we look at the active attack surface, which is for those open ones, what's actually being attacked by attackers. Um, and that number is on average less than 8%, less than 9%, between 8 to 9%, sorry. But it's small, it's manageable, right? And we can list those. And that becomes here's your prioritization to respond and to patch, because these are the ones that are open, and that attackers are actually going after.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about this report too is you actually quantify the number of things you're seeing on the dark web, and one of those is the number of vulnerabilities you saw discussed in the second half of 2023, which is only just over 200,
Right.
right? So I think that further kind of focuses that. Hey, vulnerability management is very much a game of what can I safely ignore, so I can focus on the right things, right?
Yeah, and the red zone really is another heat map, right? It's just looking at vulnerabilities, but it's the same
Right.
idea as a MITRE attack and TTPs, right? That strategy. This is specific to vulnerabilities. Yeah. That,
Yeah, and
the
then
other thing, sorry, the other thing quickly on the vulnerability one. This is the other end of the spectrum. So that's the what do I need to do now, right? And then there's the what should I have done years ago, which is the again we found 98% of organizations are experiencing attacks from CVEs that are 5+ years. some cases even older than that. But that's
Yeah.
you know that's
Yeah.
a
Why
result
are
of the sorry.
I was just gonna say, like, why are we having this meeting on this new side channel attack when Eternal Blue is still unpatched on 45 systems, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the reason for that is, of course, unlike conventional weapons, this is source code, right? It's so easy to take that, put it into yet another exploit kit. It keeps on adding more and more of those tools. They're being sold on dark web forums. It's automation, right? Um, and yeah, but it still works in some cases.
Yeah, and I love the chart on page 23, which shows the EPSS score for a specific vulnerability for the WooCommerce payments plugin vulnerability, which is CV 2023 121,
Mhm.
and just showing how that EPSS score changes in reaction to like a Metasploit module being created for this vulnerability
Yeah,
over
yeah.
time.
EPSS is fantastic. So as you said, this is a special interest group from First. Actually, CVSS also came from First.org, right? And that's been around a long time. It's widely
Oh, I
used, of
didn't realize
course.
that.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and so it's widely used. Obviously, it's the criticality rating, but it's a snapshot, right? EPSS is simply dynamic, so it carries that on and says, "What's it gonna? What is the state of this today?" And like anything, attacks come in campaigns. They come in waves. It can be really hot. It can die down. It can come back. We actually issue outbreak alerts from that. So again, if there's one campaign on, let's say, a ransomware variant leveraging a CVE, we'll issue an alert. It can die down 4 months later. It same, same. The ransomware variant comes on with a new CVE as an example. We can list that, or vice versa, right? If it's the same CVE, different attack. Yeah. So it's important to follow those because they do get recycled and used a lot. EPSS has been around for some time now. It's becoming much more widely adopted, which is great in the industry, and it allows us. We show that in the report. We show our interpretation and view of the score based off of our telemetry, what it looks like, what's the probability of attack, how it changes over time as well too, and you get that bell curve, right? You get the initial wave of attack that you can predict.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting following it. I've had a lot of chats with Michael Reutman and Jay Jacobs over the years.
Yeah,
As it was started out as kind of like a joint project between folks at Scientia and folks at Kenna Security, which is now um, I think some of those folks have moved on, but they continue this work, and I love that it's found a home at First, because now you've got a free API where you just pass it a CVE number and you get back an EPSS score. So
exactly.
like
Yeah,
even the worst programmer out there can pretty easily set up connection where you can calculate that EPSS score every day and respond to it. Like in the case of this what I really like about this graph on WooCommerce, the WooCommerce vulnerability, is you can clearly see that you had about a week, a little over a week between when that Metasploit module was created and we started seeing exploit attempts against it in the wild.
yep, exactly. Yeah, and it goes in line with what we're talking about before, right? The average again is actually shorter than that, the 4.76, but in this case, it
Mm.
shows a week. Either way, it's a relatively small window, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but don't forget about that long tail of vulnerabilities, like those. Maybe somebody just decided to accept the risk on them. They're too hard to patch. Like the vendor wouldn't support it. Like you can't lose sight of that stuff either. Clearly,
Yeah,
attackers don't lose sight of the old vulnerabilities that still work. So
yeah, yeah, 100%. And that I don't think that's ever going to change, right? That's just the nature of it. I think with again a lot of these kits, turnkey things that are being, and it's the crime as a service ecosystem. You mentioned the focus more on vulnerabilities versus other vectors of attack. That's a big business model now too. Initial access brokers, right? They only do
yeah,
that
yeah,
first half of the chain, right? Let's just penetrate a system. We'll stop there. We're just going to sell it to the highest bidder or bidders, plural, to those networks.
Yeah, and info stealers, would you consider that part of that kind of initial access broker network, the different markets where you can buy credentials and stuff like that?
Uh, yeah, stolen credentials, absolutely. It's part of that game, right? Because they're trying to basically hand over as much as you need just to, and they'll market it like that to take over a network. Usually it's Active Directory or other things, but it can be stolen credentials also put in there as a pack.
Yeah, and it's another thing interesting in the report. I talked about the different stats you pull off the dark web. We haven't seen stolen payment details in the headlines for probably a decade or more, but it still happens. I love that you have the number there, like over 850,000 payment cards were up for sale. So
Yeah,
that's still a thing. That there's still a market for that.
yeah. That is in terms of cybercrime and services. I would say that's the low hanging fruit. You're right; it's been around forever, but hey, for people that are trying to make a quick buck, they still follow that model, right? Absolutely.
Before we wrap here, anything else in a report, really caught your attention that we haven't discussed so far, or anything where if somebody only has 10 minutes to go through this report, you would point them to that we haven't mentioned.
Yeah, I would say the other one would be on just two things quickly. And again, not new here. This is known, but it's just restates the fact. Botnets, so dwell time. Spent a lot of reports on this in the industry. Our number is 85 days on average to cease for botnets. So it's again the MTTR, the mean time to respond. We know the threat's there. How quickly are organizations responding to it? Um,
Yeah.
85 days. It's big, right? Some numbers even have it pegged higher. You've seen in other reports like 200 plus. So that's still a challenge in the industry. The other one is APT. So going back to the ransomware we talked about, because of the nature of these targeted attacks, I think we've talked about this before. Advanced persistent cybercrime, so cyber criminal groups behaving like APT groups. This is just evidence of that in the report, right? The drop in volume one ransomware, the shift to OT targets, all the stuff we talked about earlier. Um, but because of this shared infrastructure happening, we're seeing more APT groups active than we had before. So the number in the last two reports were over 30%. In this report, 38 out of the 143 named APT groups. So, and again, those even for APT, those cycles are increasing as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think on dwell time, we that's a deeper story there. You almost have to break that down because, kind of uh, conflates a bunch of different things that are happening. Like if the defender's going to detect it, how quickly do they detect it? Because that number is somewhat skewed by a ransomware crew being incentivized to tell you, hey, you've been hacked and now you need to pay.
Yeah,
So that kind of skews those numbers because that's going to happen much more quickly. So a lot
yeah,
of the drop we saw in dwell time over the years wasn't because we got better at detection. It was because there was an incentive for them to tell us, hey, you haven't noticed, but you may not have noticed this, but we hacked you and now we want money.
yeah, and it's
um you
also
know,
the initial access broker aspect, right? Because they're stopping on the stealth aspect first on penetration and then waiting, right? Um,
yeah,
so that also adds to it.
right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So there's an incentive for them to stay hidden for a while. And yeah, technically nothing malicious has happened yet, right? Like they've got access to your network, but there's technically been no breach. So when does the clock start? I
yeah,
guess is the question there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, those are. I think we covered most of it. Those, I mean, it's a lot, of course, but those are some of the main points. But I just wanted to point out, going back to what you said, we always talk about the the bad, and there's obviously a lot of bad in there, but there is also a lot of the good news, like the partnerships we talked about, the EPSS active implementations that are helping us to respond, be more practical. Back to the technology piece, how we can actually, I do believe we can move quicker as defenders than the offense right now, than that 5-day window. Absolutely, we can responding to the threats. So
Well, this might be a spicy take, but a lot of reports have come out in the last month. Mandiant's M-Trends report, the Verizon DBIR. But honestly, I got more out of your report than both of those reports combined. So it might be a spicy take, but I love the amount of actionable information in this report. It was great.
I appreciate it. Yeah, and again, there's so much data to sift through, and I think it's also about the industry, how we can work together and provide more tools, more everything we're doing on the threat intelligence sharing. That's also a piece of this too, right? So it's the stronger together aspect. But yeah, it's what we always like to focus on with the research.
Well, keep up the good work. Love digging through these with you and chatting about the insights. And thank you so much for joining me on Enterprise Security Weekly today, Derek.
All right. Thanks, Adrian. Stay safe.
And a big thanks to everyone watching or listening. Stick around for some of the executive interviews that I and other Security Weekly hosts recorded at this year's RSA. And we'll be back to our regular show next week.